It began in a courtroom packed with tension, every eye on Anna Walker as she sat silent, composed, her chin lifted despite the shame he meant to inflict. Across the table, her husband, Mark Elliott, leaned back in his chair, a thin, cruel smirk playing on his lips as he took the pen and signed the divorce papers, each stroke deliberate, mocking, as if he were branding her failure in front of witnesses. The room murmured, the judge's gavel hovered, and then, just as Mark exhaled triumph, the judge cleared his throat. Everyone froze. He held up a sealed envelope and said in measured tones, "By order of the late William Walker, all assets shall pass not to Mr. Elliott, but to Mrs. Walker, subject to conditions which I now read." A hush descended. The words stunned. The smirk on Mark's face faltered. And for a moment, Anna's world held its breath, because what happened next would silence the courtroom and turn that moment of humiliation into an unexpected reckoning. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. From the moment Judge Harrison unfolded the sealed envelope, the courtroom was no longer a place for routine legal formality, but the stage for a reckoning that no one, least of all Mark Elliott, had anticipated. People leaned forward in their seats, whispering, trying to make sense of why William Walker's final testament was being read aloud in the middle of a divorce hearing. Why here? Why now? What possible connection could a dead man's will have with the smirk that had just danced across Mark's face as he signed away his marriage? The questions weighed heavily, louder than the silence that filled the room. Why was the father's will introduced at such a moment? What secret was buried within the inheritance that would change the meaning of everything? And how would this single act, a few lines on a page, turn the tables on Mark Elliott, a man so sure he had already won? This is not just a story of betrayal between a husband and wife, not just another broken marriage ending in bitterness. It is about power, the kind that stretches beyond the grave, about legacy, carefully guarded, and about a twist so sharp it forced everyone in that courtroom to reconsider who truly held control all along. Elaine Davenport was the kind of woman people often overlooked, not because she lacked presence, but because she carried herself with quiet grace that never demanded attention. She had grown up in the shadow of her father, Charles Davenport, a man known across state lines for his brilliance in business and his sharp sense of foresight. Charles had built his empire from almost nothing, transforming a modest family investment firm into a powerhouse that influenced markets and politics alike. But where Charles commanded respect through power, Elaine commanded it through loyalty, kindness, and restraint. To those who knew her, she was steady, dependable, the sort of woman who gave without counting the cost. And when she met Martin Reed, she believed she had finally found someone who saw her for more than her father's name. At first, Martin seemed to be everything she could want. He was charismatic, well-dressed, quick with a joke at dinner parties, and eager to show her off as though she were his prized discovery. Friends and acquaintances envied the match, whispering that Elaine had been fortunate to find a man who could match her world of elegance and wealth with his own social brilliance. Their wedding was the kind that graced society pages, a grand affair with chandeliers, champagne, and smiles, wide enough to convince anyone that this union was built to last. For a while, Elaine allowed herself to believe in the fairy tale. She devoted herself to Martin, supporting his ambitions, flattering his ego, and standing beside him in every social gathering where he thrived on admiration. But behind closed doors, cracks began to form. Martin's charm was most effective in public. At home, it thinned into impatience and arrogance. He grew critical of Elaine's quiet nature, mocking her for lacking the flair he believed was necessary to keep up appearances. He took pride in belittling her in small ways that only she could feel, subtle reminders that he considered himself the superior half of the marriage. Elaine endured it with dignity, hoping the man she had first loved would resurface, but the more she yielded, the bolder Martin became. Charles Davenport, however, saw through Martin from the very beginning. To Charles, Martin was a man who craved the glow of wealth without understanding the discipline it required to build it. He distrusted Martin's ambition, recognizing it as greed dressed in sophistication. Charles had warned Elaine in gentle but firm tones, telling her not to be blinded by a smile that disappeared when no one was watching. A man's true character, Charles once told her, is revealed not by how he treats strangers in public, but by how he speaks to you when the room is empty. Elaine brushed off her father's concern, determined to believe her marriage could withstand the private storms. Yet Charles, shrewd as ever, made preparations that his daughter would only come to understand after his passing. When Charles died, Elaine grieved deeply, not just for the loss of a father, but for the anchor he had been in her life. Martin, on the other hand, saw opportunity. He stepped into the spotlight of the Davenport family name, adopting the prestige without honoring its weight. To society, he was the polished son-in-law of a great man, but to Charles's close confidants, he was an opportunist waiting for his moment. What Elaine didn't know then, what Martin could never have guessed, was that Charles had already accounted for him. In the quiet of his study, long before his final breath, Charles had sealed away instructions in a will that would make certain Martin Reed would never succeed in exploiting the empire he had built. As the marriage deteriorated further, Elaine's strength became evident. Though she remained poised, she learned to endure Martin's humiliations in silence, waiting, watching, gathering resolve. She knew the man who once brought her roses now only brought her shame, but she also knew her father's words carried weight. In her heart, she trusted that Charles had seen what she refused to admit, and that one day his voice would speak again when she needed it most. By the time the divorce hearings began, Martin had become bolder than ever, confident that Elaine's quiet nature meant she would yield not only her heart, but her fortune as well. He strutted into court with the arrogance of a man certain of victory. Elaine, however, carried something he did not, the knowledge that Charles Davenport had not lived his life to let greed undo his legacy. The truth was waiting, hidden in the sealed envelope that Judge Harrison now held in his hands, and soon Martin would learn that the empire he thought he had claimed was never his to inherit. Martin Reed had always been restless, and as the years wore on, his discontent became impossible to disguise. What began as subtle distance soon grew into something Elaine Davenport could no longer ignore. He found companionship in the shadows, first in whispered phone calls, then in long evenings away under the pretense of business meetings, and finally in the arms of another woman who adored the charm Elaine had grown weary of. The affair was not carefully hidden, for Martin thrived on the thrill of deception. The whispers traveled quickly through dinner parties and social gatherings, rippling into conversations where Elaine was present but too dignified to respond. Friends exchanged uneasy glances, and strangers watched as Martin's cruelty unfolded in the most public way possible. At a lavish dinner in a restaurant known for its exclusivity, Martin leaned too close to his mistress, laughing loudly, while Elaine sat across from him with her dignity intact, the quiet subject of pitying looks. He thrived on humiliating her, drawing strength from her silence, mistaking it for weakness. As the gossip spread, Elaine became the reluctant center of conversations she never asked for. Headlines in local society columns whispered of betrayal, while Martin carried on with arrogance, speaking as though he had already won his freedom and her fortune. To him, the divorce was not just an ending but a performance, an opportunity to parade his supposed victory. When the proceedings finally began, Martin walked into court with the swagger of a man convinced he was untouchable. He smirked across the table, tapping his pen in impatience, mocking Elaine's calm demeanor with condescending remarks loud enough for those nearby to hear. Each time his signature scratched across a page, he did so with exaggerated flair, as if he were inscribing his triumph for the world to witness. But what Martin failed to realize was that Elaine's silence was not surrender. It was resolve. Her composure was not born of defeat, but of knowledge that he had underestimated both her and her father. Judge Harrison watched as Martin basked in his arrogance, oblivious to the envelope resting on the bench, an envelope sealed years before, entrusted to the court with instructions from Charles Davenport himself. And as the final document slid across the table and Martin signed it with one last mocking flourish, the judge's hand moved toward the envelope. The courtroom grew still, a hush falling over the crowd as though the air itself carried anticipation. For while Martin believed the stage belonged to him, Elaine knew the spotlight was about to shift. Her father had left behind more than memories. He had left behind a reckoning that would strip Martin of everything he thought he had gained. Charles Davenport was not a man who built his empire by chance. Every deal he struck, every partnership he forged, carried the mark of calculation. He was shrewd, deliberate, and most of all, a man who saw people not only as they were, but as they might become. In boardrooms he was feared. At home he was respected, if not always understood. His daughter Elaine Davenport was the only person who softened his edges, the one he trusted implicitly. But when it came to Martin Reed, Charles's eyes were sharp, his instincts unyielding. From the very first handshake, Charles sensed something in Martin he could not trust. Martin was charming, yes, the kind of man who could light up a room, but beneath the charm Charles saw ambition without discipline, hunger without honor. Their relationship was strained, a quiet tug-of-war waged through sidelong glances at dinners and clipped exchanges in offices. Martin believed Charles was simply an aging relic, unwilling to let go of power. Charles, however, knew Martin's charisma was nothing more than a mask, one that would eventually crack. Before his passing, Charles took careful steps to ensure his empire would never fall into the wrong hands. Lawyers remember late-night meetings where Charles outlined documents in painstaking detail. There were sealed envelopes, notarized letters, and instructions delivered with a precision that left no room for doubt. Some who worked with him swore he spoke as though he could see the future, as though he knew a storm was coming, and Elaine would one day stand in its path. And so the shadow of his will lingered, even years after his death. Elaine often remembered fragments of his words, hints of protections he promised, but never fully explained. Her lawyers began piecing it together, conversations recalled, files rediscovered, notes tucked away in drawers. Whispers grew louder that Charles had left behind something extraordinary, a testament that was more than paper. But what exactly had he written? Each revelation deepened the suspense. A sealed envelope was uncovered in a safe deposit box, stamped with the Davenport crest. A notary recalled a visit from Charles, where he demanded absolute secrecy. The tension mounted, and with every discovery, one truth became clearer. This was not an ordinary inheritance. And just when the courtroom seemed poised to declare Martin Reed the victor, the weight of Charles's foresight loomed like a gathering storm. Every 10 minutes, a new piece of the puzzle appeared. A flashback to Charles, warning Elaine that she must always protect herself. A lawyer recalling Charles's instructions to be revealed only when the time is right. A document hinting that the will was tied directly to her marriage to Martin. The question burned hotter with each revelation. What Charles wrote would change everything. The day of the final hearing arrived, and the courtroom was thick with whispers before the judge even entered. Elaine Davenport sat at the plaintiff's table, her back straight, her face calm. To the untrained eye she appeared composed, but inside her pulse raced. Across the room, Martin Reed lounged with the same arrogance he had carried throughout the trial. He wore a smirk that seemed to sneer at the very idea of consequence, as though this was all a formality before he collected what he believed was his prize. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. The air was heavy, tense. Elaine's attorneys adjusted their papers, their eyes flickering toward her, but Elaine never broke her gaze from the desk in front of her. Martin leaned back in his chair, signed the stack of divorce documents with a flourish, and chuckled under his breath. His mocking tone carried across the chamber, a cruel reminder of the man he had become. But then, something shifted. The judge cleared his throat and, Rather than moving to close the proceedings, he paused. He reached into a folder and withdrew a sealed document marked with the crest of the Davenport family. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Martin raised an eyebrow, still smirking, convinced this was another hollow formality. Elaine's breath caught in her throat. She recognized the seal instantly. It was her father's. The judge adjusted his glasses and spoke in deliberate tones. By request of the late Charles Davenport, this document is to be read in conjunction with these proceedings. The room went still. For a moment, silence hung so thick it was suffocating. Even Martin leaned forward slightly, though his grin never faded. He thought whatever Charles left behind, it could not possibly threaten him now. The judge began to read, his voice steady. At first the language was vague, almost ceremonial. Words about family legacy, about foresight and protection, about the importance of loyalty. Martin rolled his eyes and crossed his arms, his posture dripping with impatience. But then the words sharpened, cutting through the quiet like glass. All assets held within the Davenport estate, including shares, properties, and financial holdings, shall remain under the sole stewardship of Elaine Davenport. No spouse, present or future, shall hold claim or authority over them. The courtroom gasped. Martin's smirk faltered, just slightly, though he tried to mask it with a scoff. The judge did not look up. He leaned closer to the page, his tone grave now, carrying weight with every syllable. "And further," he said, pausing as if the next words would decide the fate of everyone in the room. The crowd leaned forward, breathless. Elaine's hands tightened in her lap. Martin's eyes narrowed, the mockery gone, replaced by something sharper. The judge took one last breath, his eyes scanning the final clause. Then he leaned in, voice low but firm. The words that followed would not only silence the room, they would redefine everything Martin thought he had won, and with that, the reading cut to black. The judge's voice carried through the silent courtroom as he read the final clause of Charles Davenport's will. His tone was steady, deliberate, leaving no room for doubt or misinterpretation. "It is hereby stated," he began, "that Martin Reed, in light of his conduct and disregard for the values of this family, shall be excluded from any claim to the Davenport estate, whether direct or indirect. Furthermore, any attempt on his part to access or leverage these assets shall be considered an act of fraud and pursued accordingly by the estate's legal trustees." The room exploded in gasps and murmurs. Lawyers shifted uncomfortably, reporters scrambled to jot down notes, and spectators leaned in as if they had just witnessed history unfold. Martin Reed, who only moments earlier had mocked the entire proceeding with his smug grin, sat frozen. His smirk was gone, replaced by the first flicker of panic. His jaw clenched, his shoulders tightened, and for once in his life, he had no words. Elaine Davenport remained perfectly still. She did not smile, nor did she gloat. She simply watched, her eyes steady and her face unreadable, as her father's foresight dismantled the man who had tried to humiliate her. The silence she carried spoke louder than any victory cry. This was justice, not revenge. Martin rose abruptly, as if standing might somehow change the gravity of what had just been declared. This is ridiculous," he stammered, but his voice wavered, betraying the certainty he once projected. The judge ignored his protest, continuing to outline how every safeguard had been locked into place years earlier. Charles Davenport had anticipated this very moment. He had written protections so airtight that Martin's downfall was not only inevitable, it was inescapable. For Martin, the humiliation was total. Not only had he lost Elaine, but he had lost the future he believed was guaranteed to him. The wealth, the influence, the empire he thought he would inherit through marriage had been ripped from his grasp with a single clause. He was not just left with nothing, he was branded a fraud should he ever dare to make a claim. Every eye in the courtroom was on him now, the whispers no longer about Elaine's supposed weakness, but about Martin's disgrace. The man who had mocked, belittled, and betrayed had become the object of ridicule. His downfall was public, undeniable, and final. Elaine, calm as ever, simply breathed in the moment, her dignity intact. The shift was complete. The shame he had tried to heap upon her had returned to him 100-fold. In that instant, Martin Reed realized he had not only lost his wife, he had lost his name, his future, and the very illusion of power he had built his life upon. And as the judge brought down his gavel, the message was clear. Justice had been delivered, and Charles Davenport's shadow had ensured that his daughter would never again be underestimated. The aftermath of that courtroom revelation rippled far beyond the walls where the gavel had struck. For Martin Reed, the descent was swift and merciless. Friends who once laughed at his jokes and shared his wine now avoided his calls. Business associates who once flattered him began to distance themselves, wary of being tied to a man publicly branded as disinherited and disgraced. With no claim to the Davenport fortune, his finances collapsed almost overnight. Investments he had counted on faltered, debts began to surface, and the lavish life he flaunted soon became a hollow shell. The charm that once opened doors now closed them, and the arrogance that had fueled him became his undoing. Meanwhile, Elaine Davenport stepped into the light her father had always prepared for her. No longer the quiet wife hidden behind her husband's shadow, she was honored as Charles Davenport's rightful heir, the steward of his empire and his values. Business journals wrote about her poise and resolve, while the press could not get enough of the sensational courtroom drama. Headlines splashed across front pages read, "The Will That Shocked a Courtroom," and "Charles Davenport's Last Word Strikes Like Thunder." Reporters called her a symbol of dignity, contrasting her composure with Martin's arrogance and downfall. Yet Elaine did not seek the spotlight. In interviews, she remained measured, almost serene. She did not revel in Martin's humiliation, nor did she parade her victory. Instead, she quietly rebuilt her life, surrounding herself with the work her father had entrusted to her. Those who knew her best said her calm strength was exactly what Charles Davenport had foreseen, proof that his daughter was the true heir to his legacy. And so, as Martin Reed disappeared into the shadows of his own ruin, Elaine Davenport stood tall, her father's will not only protecting her but defining her. The moral became undeniable. Power isn't always loud, nor is it always displayed in the heat of confrontation. Sometimes it waits, patiently, silently, written on a page, waiting for the right moment to be read aloud. And when that moment comes, it can change everything. In the quiet after the storm, when the reporters had gone and the courthouse corridors no longer echoed with whispers, Elaine Davenport returned to her father's study. Among the sealed folders and carefully catalogued documents, her attorney handed her one last envelope, smaller, worn at the edges, and addressed in Charles Davenport's own handwriting. Inside was not another clause of wealth or condition of power, but a letter written in the steady, deliberate script of a man who had prepared for everything. Elaine unfolded the pages with trembling hands, and as her eyes traced each word, tears welled, not from weakness, but from a deep well of strength being restored. Her father reminded her that she was always more than Martin Reed's wife, more than the cruelty she had endured, more than the whispers that had once mocked her. He urged her to never let another's arrogance or betrayal define her worth. "You are my daughter," Charles wrote, "and that is enough to stand against any storm." Alone in the room, Elaine read his words aloud, her voice catching but steadying, as if the letter carried the final piece of armor she needed to walk forward unbroken. The moral of Charles Davenport's foresight became clear. Justice does not arrive by accident. It is shaped, prepared, and protected by those who see beyond the present. In the end, Martin Reed had mocked his wife with laughter he believed was victory, but it was Charles Davenport's voice, carried from beyond the grave, that silenced him forever, reminding everyone who heard the story that true power is not in cruelty, but in legacy, dignity, and the unshakable strength of those underestimated. What do you think? Was this justice truly served? Or did Charles Davenport go too far by controlling the outcome from beyond the grave? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you thought this was shocking, wait until you hear what happened in our next story, where a mistress walked into court smiling, but walked out in handcuffs. You won't want to miss that one. Make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the stories we uncover.